The American Civil War stands as a pivotal moment in the nation's history, a brutal conflict that pitted brother against brother and tested the very fabric of American unity. It was a war that would redefine the nation and its values, leaving a legacy that continues to shape the United States to this day. From 1861 to 1865, the young republic, founded on principles of liberty and equality, was torn apart by the divisive issue of slavery. This period saw the nation grappling with its identity and the true meaning of freedom and equality for all its citizens. This war, fought entirely on American soil, would claim the lives of over 600,000 soldiers and leave an indelible mark on the nation's social, political, and economic landscape. The sheer scale of the conflict and the devastation it wrought on communities across the country was unprecedented. The war was primarily a clash between the United States of America, the Union in the North, and the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy in the South. The Union, with its industrial might and larger population, faced off against the Confederacy, which was determined to preserve its way of life and economic system. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the nation and end the institution of slavery. Lincoln's leadership and his unwavering commitment to the principles of liberty and equality were crucial in guiding the Union through the darkest days of the war. The Confederacy, under the leadership of President Jefferson Davis, sought to break away from the Union and maintain its agrarian economy built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Davis and his supporters believed that their way of life and economic interests were under threat from the growing abolitionist movement in the North. The seeds of this internal conflict were sown long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861. The tensions between the North and South had been building for decades, fueled by economic differences, cultural clashes, and the moral question of slavery. The debate over slavery had raged for decades, fueling sectional tensions and political debates. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all attempts to address the issue, but each only served to deepen the divide. As the nation expanded westward, the question of whether slavery should be allowed in new territories ignited fierce arguments and further divided the nation along geographical lines. The concept of popular sovereignty, where settlers in new territories would decide the issue of slavery for themselves, led to violent confrontations and further inflamed passions on both sides. The stage was set for a showdown, a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could truly endure. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, seen by the South as a direct threat to their way of life, was the final catalyst that set the nation on the path to war. The American Civil War would ultimately answer that question, albeit at a tremendous cost. The war's end brought the abolition of slavery and set the stage for the long and difficult process of Reconstruction, as the nation sought to heal and rebuild in the aftermath of such a profound and transformative conflict. At the heart of the American Civil War lay the deeply contentious issue of slavery. This institution was not just a matter of economic practice, but a deeply rooted social and cultural system that defined the Southern way of life. While other factors, such as economic disparities and cultural differences, contributed to the sectional divide, the issue of slavery was the most polarizing. The North, with its rapidly industrializing economy, was moving towards a more modern, wage-based labor system. In contrast, the South's economy was heavily dependent on agriculture, particularly the production of cotton, which relied on the labor of enslaved people. This created a stark economic and social contrast between the two regions. For the Southern states, slavery was not merely an economic system, it was deeply ingrained in their social fabric, their way of life, and their sense of identity. The Southern aristocracy, with its grand plantations and opulent lifestyles, was built on the backs of enslaved laborers. The Southern economy, heavily reliant on agriculture, particularly cotton production, depended on slave labor. Cotton was the South's most lucrative crop, and the demand for it was insatiable, both domestically and internationally. Plantation owners argued that slavery was essential for their economic prosperity, and that the abolition of slavery would result in economic ruin. They believed that without the institution of slavery, their entire economic system would collapse. They viewed attempts by the North to restrict or abolish slavery as a direct attack on their way of life, and their right to self-government. The abolitionist movement in the North was gaining momentum, and Southern states felt increasingly threatened by its growing influence. The concept of states' rights played a crucial role in the South's defense of slavery. Southern leaders argued that each state had the sovereign right to determine its own laws and institutions, including the institution of slavery, without interference from the federal government. Southerners argued that individual states had the right to determine their own laws and institutions, including the institution of slavery, without interference from the federal government. This belief in states' rights was a cornerstone of Southern political thought. They believed that the federal government was overstepping its bounds by attempting to dictate policies on slavery, which they considered a matter of state sovereignty. The tension between federal authority and states' rights was a long-standing issue in American politics, but it reached a boiling point over the issue of slavery. This fundamental disagreement over the balance of power between the federal government and individual states fueled the secession crisis. Southern states felt that their rights and way of life were under direct threat from a federal government increasingly dominated by anti-slavery sentiments. When Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who campaigned on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, was elected president in 1860, it was the final straw for many Southern states. They saw his election as a clear signal that their interests would no longer be protected within the Union. Southern states viewed it as a threat to their way of life and their very existence. In response, they chose to secede from the Union, leading to the formation of the Confederate States of America and setting the stage for the Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 proved to be the tipping point that plunged the nation into civil war. His election was a significant moment in American history, marking a dramatic shift in the political landscape of the country. Lincoln's victory, without carrying a single Southern state, sent shockwaves throughout the South. The Southern states felt marginalized and feared that their way of life, which was heavily dependent on slavery, was under direct threat from the new administration. Although Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, Southerners viewed his election as a harbinger of doom, fearing that the ultimate goal of the Republican Party was the complete abolition of slavery. This fear was not unfounded, as the Republican Party had a strong anti-slavery platform, and many in the South believed that Lincoln's election would lead to the end of their economic and social systems. South Carolina, the state most ardently in favor of secession, became the first to secede from the Union in December 1860. The decision was made after a convention of delegates voted unanimously to leave the Union, citing the perceived threat to their rights and way of life. Within weeks, 6 other Southern states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America. These states believed that their only option to protect their interests was to form a new nation where they could maintain their traditions and institutions, including slavery. These states argued that they had voluntarily joined the Union, and therefore had the right to secede peacefully. They believed that the Union was a compact among sovereign states, and if the federal government violated their rights, they had the right to withdraw. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, rejected the legality of secession, declaring that the Union was perpetual and that no state had the right to secede unilaterally. He emphasized that the Union was older than the Constitution itself, and that it was binding on all states. He vowed to uphold the Constitution and preserve the Union, even if it meant resorting to force. Lincoln's commitment to maintaining the Union was unwavering, and he made it clear that he would not allow the nation to be divided. The secession of the Southern states and the formation of the Confederacy created an unprecedented crisis in American history. The nation was now on the brink of a civil war, with both sides preparing for a conflict that would determine the future of the United States. The nation was now divided, and the question of whether it could be reunited by force remained uncertain. The North and South were gearing up for a confrontation that would test their resolve and resources. The stage was set for a bloody conflict that would test the nation's resolve and determine the fate of slavery in America. The Civil War would become one of the most defining events in American history, shaping the nation's future and leaving a lasting legacy on its people and institutions. The first shots of the Civil War erupted on April 12, 1861, at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Confederate forces under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard bombarded the federal fort after Union forces refused to surrender. Although the bombardment itself resulted in few casualties, it marked the beginning of armed hostilities and galvanized both sides for war. The attack on Fort Sumter ignited a wave of patriotism in both the North and the South. Thousands of volunteers rushed to enlist in their respective armies, eager to defend their cause. The initial enthusiasm for war, however, would soon give way to the grim realities of the battlefield. In the early stages of the war, both sides struggled to gain a decisive advantage. The Battle of Bull Run, fought in July 1861 near Manassas, Virginia, was a sobering experience for the Union Army, which suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Confederate forces. The battle shattered any illusions of a quick and easy victory for the North and demonstrated the resolve and military prowess of the Confederacy. The war, however, was not only fought on battlefields but also in the court of public opinion. Both the Union and the Confederacy sought to garner support for their cause both domestically and abroad. The issue of slavery in particular played a crucial role in shaping international perceptions of the war.